Hello, everyone. How you doing? My name is Calvin Nobles, and I'm here with my colleagues. And today we're going to be talking to you about combating cognitive warfare's deceitful tactics in a hyperactive charged society. And one other thing you will notice, this topic is very contemporary in today's environment where we have so much uh, things that are happening, information that's causing us to think and look at things differently, question things differently. And we're living in a hyper-connected environment digitally, and we have access to so much information more so than ever before. But there are also some negative consequences as well as some positive consequences. But today we're going to talk about the deceitful tactics in combating our cognitive abilities. And so to get started here, we need to really define what is cognitive warfare. In its simplest term, cognitive warfare is essentially deceitfulness and just erroneous and manipulation of our minds and our psychological abilities through the use of disinformation and misinformation. So that's what it is in its most simplest term. It's also a weapon of influence. When we talk about cognitive warfare, how information is being used to really undermine our institutional trust and practices in our institutions and our organizations and our governments, and really to enhance and influence public opinion, whether it's even if it's negative or even if it's erroneous or if it's wrong, it's still having an impact in terms of being able to influence it. And from a societal aspect, again, we live in a very hyper-connected society where we're always connected digitally. And so having the ability to play on someone's cognitive assets, their mind, their psychology, their biases, their heuristics, these things become very concerning, especially as we continue to live in a society where it becomes much more simpler and easier to do this. And so at the end of the day, we have to take protection to guard our cognitive abilities, our mind, and just our overall ability to understand that we are exploitable due to the very nature of just being human. Next, let us talk about misinformation and disinformation. Now, we use them interchangeably quite often, but we need to understand there's some differences between disinformation and misinformation. So let's start with misinformation. It's the intentional spread of false or inaccurate information. It's often the result of mistakes, misunderstanding, or lack of verification, right? But remember, something to think about, even though we're talking about misinformation, what about the individual that is proliferating that information? What are they thinking and why are they doing it? They're doing it because there's probably an aim or something that they're trying to get out of it. Even if that aim is just simply fun, joking around, laughter, whatever it may be. And the flip side of that is that there's always harm. These things are not done in an environment where they're not causing harm. They are causing harm. So when we talk about disinformation, it's deliberate the creation of and dissemination of false information with the intent to deceive or manipulate our particular audiences. It is often crafted to influence public opinion, advance specific strategies, or sow discord. And so now that we know what the two is, now we got to understand that misinformation and disinformation, at the very least, just think about how disinformation and misinformation is used by various actors in various ways. And so think about it. Today, we are a heavy user of social media platforms. When I say heavy user, think about the more westernized society, the more advanced society. We rely on social media for many things. Personally, I communicate with a lot of people on LinkedIn on a daily basis. And so it would be easy for me to be manipulated if I didn't have a very questioning attitude. But the mere fact that I'm using social media it puts me in a disadvantage because now an actor can use that platform to spread information, misinformation, and disinformation. And we talk about the algorithm aspect. Algorithms are designed to personalize content that actually target us, that reinforces our biases and create echo chambers. And so when we talk about this, think about being in around the people that are saying the same thing over and over and over, and you're not an individual that questioning the validity of that information. Some people believe this stuff without really understanding, the author and the content, and also understanding, is it true? They just believe it. We have a false sense of belief because we are very we're engaging blind trusting so much, and especially in a technological society that is creating these echo chambers, and these echo chambers are very harmful. But remember, people are involved in these particular echo chambers based on their own personal biases and their own personal gratification, things of that is very common to them, or things of different groups that they want to be involved in, different groups that they want to interact with. So when we talk about impact on society, this is where we really get into how misinformation and disinformation really plays on our cognitive abilities. One of the things we see is an erosion of trust, especially when a person of power, a person of influence, say something that's not accurately, or they say something that is misleading, or they say something to get a response from people. It also causes an erosion of trust, especially by those who have the ability to depict that this is not true, this is false information. And it causes an erosion of trust. It also causes an erosion of trust when those individuals are tied to certain organizations, whether it's government, whether it's a corporate organization or a nonprofit organization, or it could be an academic institution. When you have someone who are using misinformation or disinformation, it leads to an erosion of trust. And when it happens to be someone in power of a government, it's also very debilitating in the fact that that person is holding an office representing that government or organization. Now, people not only losing trust in the individual that's spreading the misinformation or disinformation, they also losing trust in the organization that the individual is representing. And so, and the other thing we see now, we see a social polarization. We see this a lot. I mean, all of us probably to some extent have experienced this, where we have an opposing view of someone, and next thing you know, we find ourselves at odds with each other due to something that's really driven by disinformation or misinformation, and it causes us to have a divisive approach to it. And so this is why you really have to understand that the information we believe in, we have to understand if it's factual or it's not, and we have to take a stance and say, I'm not arguing on this because I know that this is not factual. This also causes risk to our national security, right? Because when information is not accurately stated, and people in some parts of the world don't have access to all the communication channels and then the different media platforms that we have, and so they're getting it from one or two sources, and those one or two sources happens to be spreading misinformation or disinformation, that's very harmful, and that could lead to an uproar or some instability there that's all surrounded by national security. I see you have some questions coming in here. Okay, and when we get to the end, we'll do our best to answer all the questions that you'll put in the chat. Thank you for asking the questions, and we will definitely get around to answering your questions. Increase anxiety and fear. And so think about, in today's environment, we work with organizations or governments or higher ed institutions or in corporate sectors where we're battling all kinds of different cyber threats, right? And we're getting them on our phones, we're getting them via emails, we're getting them via social media. These threats are endless. They're coming at you every day from so many ways. And now on top of that, you're now dealing with misinformation and disinformation. And not to, leave without stating this, sometimes the misinformation and disinformation is the cyber threat itself to get us to do something, to respond in a way that will enable us enabling a malicious attack to be carried out against us. And so again, when we have increased anxiety and fear, a lot of people are afraid or they don't want to do certain things because they don't want to enable the situation to become worse, such as clicking on a link, or when you get a text message that said, hey, vote for some candidate that's running for government office, or in some cases, auto insurance. We've all been victims of this auto insurance, whether it's via email or whether it's through text messages. We get all kind of things that come in this, and it's malicious, and we have to find a way to not click on those links or not be bothered by those things. But if you're a person who's bothered by that, it could definitely make you very anxious and fear of responding to anything. And so, disinformation exploits fear, presenting exaggerated threats, fostering a sense of vulnerability. And I spend a lot of time, and I spent a lot of time in my past working in cybersecurity. And even sometimes when I get a message on my phone, I get one on my email, I get somebody calling me at work, and I'm like, you know what? These people are relentless. The threats will just keep coming. And sometimes when you call people, just telling you, hey, this is calling you from your bank just to inform you of this, right? You know that information is not true. And so the best thing to do is just, in that case, just to hang up. But at the same time, it also is jolting in the fact that when somebody says there's a situation going on with your banking account, I don't care who you are, you have to stop and think and say, is it? Right? Even if you know it's misleading, it still causes some concern and some anxiety there, even though we know it might not be true. And the manipulation can lead to panic, irrational behavior, poor decision making, and it can also further enable the situation. And so this is sometimes when we are dealing and with misinformation or disinformation. In some cases, there's time pressure applied to that, and that time pressure is to get you to do something rather quickly, and so that you will take a misstep or you won't pay attention to the overall context of the situation of what's going on, that you are that you're dealing with misinformation or disinformation, right? So sometimes you just have to take a step back and relax before you move on to get out of this state of being anxious or being fearful. Cognitive dissonance. How many of us have ever dealt with a situation where we know something is not right, or we know that it's causing us some discomfort or whatever we're dealing with. And a lot of times, just to get out of the situation, we would do something. I was speaking a couple months ago with a young lady who actually caused her organization to undergo an attack. And today, when we talk about it, she said, I know it was wrong, but I did it anyway. I couldn't, I tried to talk myself out of it, but I just couldn't. I always asked her, why couldn't you? And she said, I had a lot going on, and I knew it was wrong, but I didn't really believe 100% that it was wrong. I didn't really know what to do. I was overwhelmed. And so guess what? It kind of put her, in the psychology world, we call that the visceral effect. And the visceral effect, when something overwhelms you, and then when it overwhelms you, you have ability to misstep, take actions that are wrong. And that's exactly what happened. So, cognitive dissonance was very hard for her to overcome that situation at that time. And then we have an avoidance of resolution. How many times are we at work and we receive something or we hear something and we know it's not correct? And even though it's not correct, we'll go along with it, right? And so a lot of times, we see this, and it's hard to overcome that cognitive dissonance as well. And we have a hard time rejecting, and we end up rejecting the factual information sometimes and clinging to the infactual information. And again, this is what makes the avoidance of resolution very difficult. That visceral effect is a real effect for people because sometimes you might be dealing with 2 or 3 factors trying to overcome the avoidance of resolution. It's very difficult to fight through for some people, especially if you're stressed out, if you're overworked, if you're dealing with physical and psychological issues, or even if you're just dealing with a work environment that's quite toxic or a work environment overwhelming for you. Things like this are very, I don't want to say they're common, but you can see why they happen because the person is overwhelmed. And so when we talk about erosions of critical thinking and judgment, we talk about impaired decision. How many of us have made a wrong decision because of disinformation, right? And the one thing I wanted to say is that I've seen this over and over. People will take wrong information and base a decision off of. And the reason they're doing that is because there's an erosion of their critical thinking and their judgment when they're dealing with that particular situation. And so we have to always be willing to step back to get out of that situation so we can not be making decisions that's not the best for the organization or as for us as individuals, and realize that we are involved in impaired decision making. But the one thing I would say about that is how many organizations really prepare employees or or is there a training session that people can undergo to really help them with, you know, dealing with misinformation or disinformation? And then we have confirmation bias. And this is where misinformation feeds confirmation bias by reinforcing faulty beliefs, making individuals less likely to consider alternative perspectives and evidence. And sometimes you hear the saying, the person that barked the loudest wins, right? And so sometimes those individuals are overpowering because they are very convincing in their beliefs. And their belief happens to be misinformation, or it might be in some case disinformation, whatever it may be. It's very convincing to the other person because they just want to get beyond that situation. They'll go along with it. You know, we talked about this earlier, reduced trust in information. We have a lot of that now. Now you can say something and you can say whatever it is, this first person going to say, hey, what did you get from that? What did you get that from? What's the source, right? Especially as researchers, you know, we always say, what source? And then we'll go and we'll research that source to see if that source is credible and reputable to make sure before we leverage that into our body of knowledge, right? So there's even for me, you know, I do a lot of speaking around, you know, the human element in cybersecurity, and people always ask me, where did you get that from? How do you know? And so sometimes I produce resources showing that the information and things that I'm saying is true, because I do not want to be a person that's out here spreading and proliferating things that are misinformation or disinformation. And some people don't have the ability to evaluate information. For instance, some people will leverage Wikipedia. Now, I'm not here to say, you know, Wikipedia is great. I'm not here to say Wikipedia is bad. I just know that anybody can change information on Wikipedia. You can add something on Wikipedia, whether it's true or false, right? And so my thing is, what I always tell people to do is look for more valid sources. Look for sources of people that got a reputable upstanding um, ability to put out reputable information, that is. But that is still difficult to do in today's time because people still question other people and their ability to send out information. And so we talk about psychological manipulation. We talk about, you know, the loss of autonomy. And this erodes an individual autonomy, leading people to accept and hold on to misinformation, making it difficult to distinguish between what is fact, what is fiction, right? And we see that a lot. And then we talk about emotional exploitation. These campaigns target emotions such as fear, anger, and hope, manipulating people's thoughts, actions, you know, further causing that division and polarization. And this has been, believe it or not, one of the reasons when we talk about disinformation and misinformation that enables cyber threats, that's why the time pressure piece is so important. Because what you try to do, you try to prevent individuals from having the ability to articulate and consult with other people, because other people can help inform them that they're dealing with a situation that's not truthful or a situation that's misleading, trying to deceive them into doing something they should not be doing. But the psychological manipulation is real. I mean, we talk about it a lot. I mean, everybody see this on a daily basis, whether you, especially now, and especially in the United States, we're talking about political season over here, politics. There's so many different campaigns on TV. Things are said, they're not completely true. Things are said, they're not actually completely false. So where do you stand? Where do you go? This is a hard dichotomy for somebody to digest and be able to deal with. So, and people, we try to get to the root of this. Most of us do. Some of us don't. That's what leads to those echo chambers that we talked about earlier, when people don't work hard enough to find the facts and to be factually informed on really what's going on. So and this also leads to us getting into cognitive overload. A lot of people don't understand they get into cognitive overload on a daily basis. Remember, we're living in a very digitized society where we come across a lot of information. Well, I know some of us do. I'm not going to say most of us, a lot of us do, but I know I come across a lot of information. People I work with, we deal with a lot of information, whether it's emails or whether it's meetings or whether it's just changes across the organizations and policies or it's just the expansion of organization. Those things expose us to a lot more information. And so we have to be mindful of the stress due to the information overload. And so that puts us in a state of cognitive overload. When you are in a cognitive overloaded state, you are prone to accept things that are deceitful, things that are wrong, such as misinformation or disinformation, because you don't have the ability to cognitively fight through to find the truth, and that causes decision paralysis. And that where people are becoming very helplessly, and that's leading to indecision and a feeling of being unable to discern the truth. And so, well, sometimes we see this with senior managers where they're dealing with a lot. They're trying to process a lot of things within the run of a day, and they get to a point where they have decision paralysis, where they just overwhelmed and they just might not be able to get to the point to deal with the facts from fiction, right? And so that's due to decision paralysis. And so next we want to talk about social and emotional fragmentation. And so we see this a lot where, I have friends who have left different forums on different social media platforms because they felt like they were alienated or they were isolated because they will always ask questions. And these are, especially when someone's trying to get to the bottom of it, try to understand, is this true or not? And so a lot of times this individual feel isolated and alienated because they're going against the echo chamber. And anytime you fight in the echo chamber and you in that chamber with people that all think alike and they want to think alike and they want to be there, that's very concerning because you're going to be the one that's going to become the prey. And so again, it leaves people feeling alienated and isolated. We talk about increased hostility and conflict. We see this amongst our loved ones, our friends, our neighbors, our coworkers, when we all have a difference of opinion. And sometimes that difference of opinion might be driven by misinformation or some disinformation, and all it does is just causes more separation and creation amongst us. And it also leads to erosion of social cohesion. And so I've seen this at work, I've seen it amongst my friends, I've seen it amongst my family, where people believe things that they believe, whether it's fact or in most cases, the thing that causes things where people have a difference of opinion. And a lot of time it's not factual, but people have such strong beliefs in what they believe. Guess what? It leads to erosion of social cohesion. And then we have a heightened susceptibility to further manipulation. And just like when someone is vulnerable to something, once you become vulnerable to it and you're not able to fight through it or work through it to get to the facts, and you start believing in misinformation, the more information you hear about that particular topic, whether especially if it aligns with the agenda that you're willing to accept, then you're vulnerable to disinformation in the future. And then we have the dependence on misinformation networks. And some people really believe in different political views from different politicians, no matter what. They're going to stick with that political view, even when they know it's wrong. They will find a way to make it right. And so that they depend on that misinformation from that network to continue to feed them that diet of misinformation so they can stay right and so that they can also continue to blossom in that echo chamber. And that also makes them vulnerable to being vulnerable to future disinformation. And then the erosion of critical thinking. Some people don't want to think critically. Some people don't know how to think critically. They will believe whatever a person standing in front of them telling them. They don't have the ability to go and research things, or they don't have the energy. In some cases, they just ignorant to the fact that they're just going to believe whatever the person is telling them. And so we have to develop the ability to be able to go out and think critically and understand the facts and what they mean and put them in the proper context so we can move beyond something being misinformed or disinformed. So now we're going to get into some technological solutions to combat cognitive warfare. And so one of the things we're going to talk about is AI detection. We have a lot of AI capabilities, and these things are beginning to shape how we understand and how we integrate them into what we're doing. The first thing I would say is that all technology is great, but there's also consequences of technology. And so some of that technology, especially if it's designed and it's biased in the design, then it's going to lead to biased decisions no matter what. So we have to work through that. And so even with our machine learning algorithms, even though they can identify patterns in disinformation campaigns, the things we have to ask is, how do we trust the technology? And that's where we get into explainable AI. Can we understand what's happening with the black boxes of AI? If not, if we don't understand it and how things are working, then we become exposed, or we become to the point to where we can become disinformed if we don't question the AI and explain the black boxes of how the AI is working. Verification system, blockchain can ensure the authenticity of online content. But again, how do we apply that to all these different platforms? There's a cost to that. Most platforms are not going to be able to verify it because is it worth the cost of integrating this type of technology to a platform? Real-time monitoring. Digital platforms can monitor content in real time. And in some cases they do. And people will post, this is misinformation, this is disinformation. And it stays on the platform for days before they're able to take action because, not here defending the technology platform owners, but I am going to say there's so much information on platforms today that the companies that own the platform owners are overwhelmed trying to manage the amount of disinformation and misinformation on the platform. In some cases, you tell them it's wrong, but we have to remember that platforms also lean to a certain way, and that also enables misinformation and disinformation to continue to be proliferated on the platform because that's what the organization supports. And the other thing, that one of the solutions that I really believe is more helpful than anything else is the human solution. When we see things that we know it's not right and we call it out, we should do everything in our power to proliferate. This information is not correct. It is misinformed, it's misinforming, it's disinforming, and we should call it out to the maximum extent possible so others can be alerted and others can be aware. But stand by, there's going to be some counter action to that because there's going to be some people out there to believe that. But I believe the human element of all of this can be a lot more effective than what we're saying today. And so how do we strengthen our digital platforms? What about content regulation? We see this. I see several of my friends I do go on Facebook to communicate with my family, and several of my close friends say I've been in Facebook jail. I'm like, what is Facebook jail? Well, Facebook jail is when you say something or do something against the rules. And I'm like, okay, I like that, but how can we use that when we have misinformation or disinformation to reduce that on the platform so the platform can be more trustworthy and people can believe the information that they're working with. But again, it's hard for Facebook to track down every source of misinformation and disinformation on the platform because there's so many users of this particular platform. We can do fact checking. I love the fact checking of capabilities that we do have. I think it helps bring to bear, help us understand that some information is just not factual, even though in some cases we want it to be factual, but it's not. We can talk about data sharing again. Remember what I said earlier? We as humans can post messages and highlight when something's not right. That data sharing becomes very effective in alerting the others that this information here is misleading. Transparency and accountability. How do we build on top of this, and how do we make it so that we can really enjoy our platforms, or we can enjoy messages? We get messages from the right people with the right content, and we have to have transparency and accountability. And this is when we talk about, especially with artificial intelligence today, explainable AI will help us achieve enhanced transparency and accountability. And so, but the one thing that bothers me around the whole policy thing is that, is the legislation. Legislation is slow to be implemented to help us have um, more factual information on these social media platforms. And so, how do we get legislators to join us in ensuring us that we're only seeing factual information on platforms? That's a hard legal thing. And so, but I think the one thing that we can do is help reduce the number of instances where misinformation and disinformation posts are allowed to be uploaded and posted on some of our platforms. So some of the things we can do is strengthen our critical thinking. And so even though I know for me, I get tired of hearing, can you validate that? But I kind of look at that question as multi-factor authentication. I know you want to get to your bank account. I know you want to get to your LinkedIn account, but can you complete this two-step authentication process? So same thing with when we talk about the critical thinking, when people ask, can you validate that? I look at that as the same. Yes, I can validate that because I only want to be speaking facts with people and not this situation where I'm disinforming them or misinforming them. But how do we teach this? How do we teach people to go and look for credible sources? How do we teach them to recognize misinformation, and how do we keep that from harming our decision making? I know in schools we talk about teaching students how to think critically, and then one of the things that we teach them is to have a questioning attitude. And so I think we have to have a questioning attitude. A lot of times when we see things on social media, I know the first thing people do, I'm going to Google that. It's like Google has become an official tool for everything being factual. In fact, we know that's not the truth. Everything on the internet is not true, but we rely on it so much that, if it happens, and so we Google a lot more things trying to find out if it's factual or if it's indeed erroneous information. And then we have to build on that resiliency. And that's what makes us better, is understanding that we're going to enhance our critical thinking skills, and then we're going to build on that to make us resilient so we're not falling prey to misinformation and disinformation. A lot of times when I see things, I'm skeptical, but I will research them and I find out, why am I so skeptical? A lot of times when I find out about that, my skepticism was right because I sensed that something didn't make sense here. But there's also been cases where something was strange to me and it was right. I'm like, wow, that's a learning moment, right? And that also ties back into enhancing our critical thinking when we can research things and find the facts and find out that it was actually truthful. Public awareness campaigns. This is a good one in terms of just informing everybody when things are not right. I know one of the things I saw recently was, like, during the debate, it will actually track how many times a candidate say something that's misleading or say something that's untruthful. I find that I'm like, first of all, we talk about a presidential level debate. Why are we even having this discussion? But it's a very common thing now where we talk about, where politicians don't necessarily tell the complete truth, or they might take something and lean it towards something that they're objective that they're trying to achieve. But this is where public awareness campaigns come to play, where we can share information to find out, well, how well the economy really is doing. We can talk to people who are going to give us the facts on certain topics and certain stories, so we can now help proliferate information that's factual and removing the doubt, the skepticism about information that's harmful to us. Educational workshops. I know for me, I love going to different workshops because it helps me understand something a lot more clear, and it helps me be able to enhance my critical thinking about particular topics. And so I encourage everyone to engage in uh, educational workshop. Can help us educate individuals about the dangers of cognitive warfare, how their cognitive warfare is in it's a major play right now because it's the easiest thing to attack. And it's also that one area where we get the least amount of training. How do we protect our cognitive abilities and our cognition from what's happening in the digital space or what's just happening in the world today? Very few, if any, organizations offer any training or even awareness on it. The other thing is digital literacy. How do we help people get smarter about just to develop the skills to recognize, analyze, and combat deceitful tactics. We know a lot of us love being online. I mean, I love hearing from my friends in the cyber profession first thing in the morning. If there's something going wrong, you're going to find out as soon as it happens if you connect it on social media because you start getting alerts. But we need to help people understand how to empower them to assess critical information online. Because as soon as somebody tells me so and so's been attacked, with me having a background in cybersecurity, what's the first thing I do? I Google it because I want to see if anybody else is posting it or if it's just a piece of information that somebody got wrong and now they're out there spreading information, misinforming people. And again, I struggle with this area the most. And the reason I struggle with this area the most here is because I just don't see that we have a legislative body that's able to maneuver to keep up with all of the technological changes that we're seeing in our space. And so our legal frameworks is not representative of what's happening in the digital space today with the internet. We have very few legislation governing what happened on the internet based on contemporary times. And so we got to really start arguing and articulating we want more legislative frameworks around misinformation and disinformation so that we can have the cognitive abilities that we need to be safe when we're online. Right now, we're not safe because we're very prone to misinformation and disinformation because there's so much of it on, in the digital sphere, whatever you are. I had the opportunity. I went to an event last night and was able to get in the metaverse last night and play around with that. I thought it was so amazing to be in metaverse with so many different people. But the question I asked myself, how do I know this person's who they say they are? Because people have a tendency to take on whatever persona they want to take on. Dr. Mary Aiken called that the online disinhibition effect, where people can say, you know what, I'm gonna be whoever I want to be. Clearly, I am not The Rock. Even though I adore The Rock and his acting and entertaining abilities, when I get online, I could easily become The Rock if I really wanted to. Now, I would never do that, but because we have a lack of legislation and other policies that prevented people from doing that, and we're just wearing down our cognitive abilities, this is an area where I think we need the most reinforcement right now. How do we articulate to our politicians we need better policies and regulations to make sure that the digital space, the internet, and places where we're connected remain harmful? Because right now it's not a space that's remaining free of misinformation and disinformation. In fact, I think it's actually a place with extensive amount of information that's harmful to a lot of us in so many different ways. And this is why a lot of people are getting taken advantage of. So our digital safety is at play through our own cognitive weaknesses and bias. So this is why this is so important that we get policies and regulation in place so that we don't have to deal with that. We will always deal with it, but to the degree that we have to deal with it should be significantly less than what it is today. Right now, it's a lot to deal with. We talk about our digital safety because our cognitive abilities ties into our digital safety. You cannot have people in online in the digital environment and not think about their cognitive abilities and the cognitive warfare that's occurring today. And we talk about international cooperation and combating this. The hardest thing to do is really get some type of international policy in place because every country wants their own laws. And we don't always agree on what's cybercrime, what is cognitive warfare, what is the best way to combat, disinformation. We don't always agree. And so it makes it very difficult. But in some cases, we do agree. And we still find it difficult to get any type of international framework or regulation push because it's just difficult to do across so many countries who have their own legislative framework and legal system that they're working through. But we can share intelligence and we can have global coordination. So those two things should come at almost no cost to us. But again, in some countries, they penalize very heavily for people who are caught doing things such as spreading misinformation or disinformation. In some countries, they don't. It's very difficult. But we can have a shared approach where we feel, where we believe that the internet needs to be regulated to a degree, and countries need to work harder to make sure that misinformation and disinformation is removed or reduced to a great degree so that we can have digital safety. And so when we talk about the future of cognitive welfare, one of the things that scares me is that it's expanding. Even with AI, even though we can leverage AI to create tools to help us identify cognitive warfare, to identify misinformation and disinformation, it can also be used by those who want to spread misinformation and disinformation. So there's a counterbalance. And so that's what makes the future of cognitive warfare more interesting. So is that there's a counterbalance, some interplay that's going to happen and go both ways. And the other thing is, how do we adapt? As users in this space, we're going to have to continually adapt to different tactics and techniques that's been thrown at us so that we can safeguard our own cognitive abilities. But again, some of us are, free play in this digital space because we don't really have a questioning attitude. The threat landscape is going to continue to grow. It's been growing for the last 2 decades. And the one thing we have to realize is that as we continue to see new threats and we continue to practice new threats, it's easier to engineer misinformation and disinformation campaign than it is to defend against one. It takes time, and because most of us work for organizations where we have hierarchies in place that require different levels of authorization, the defense to that is somewhat slower. So just remember that they can execute faster than we can defend against some of these different attacks and misinformation and disinformation campaigns that we're seeing. And so, in conclusion, the one thing we just want to say is that combating cognitive warfare is not a singular dimensional approach. It's a multifaceted approach, and we all have to participate in this. If you're going to be on the internet and you see something that's not right, say something, so that everybody's not having to, see misinformation and disinformation and not know if it's factual. Collaborative strategy. We can work more collaboratively with organizations, academia, industry, and government should be working together to make sure that we're creating a safer place so that our cognitive warfare is not constantly, being jeopardized while we're in the digital sphere. And then at the end of the day, it's all about protecting society and for ensuring our democracies that we can enjoy the different technologies and different spaces that we can go to from whether it's the metaverse or whether it's the different online forums or what it may be. We want to be protected in there. We want to ensure that we're not proliferating misinformation or disinformation and harming society, and better yet, harming our own dignity, our own cognitive abilities. Oh, sorry about that. So I pulled the presentation back up, but I see we have some questions in here. So we'd like to take this time to answer questions. So one of the questions, how can criminal authorities in your country investigate and find disinformation networks? That is a really good question. And, the question that I always ask is, who's responsible for disassembling disinformation networks? But to be honest with you, it depends on the severity of it, right? If somebody, we see it all the time where we on a social media platform and somebody posts, that some actor or some actress has died, right? And so again, we all go and we research and we find that's not true. Something to that level, yeah, is it harmful? Yeah, it's harmful, because again, it's passing misinformation. But there are other critical things that are happening that might come with a more of a severity, right? Like somebody's talking about a terrorist attack or some pending attack on our infrastructure somewhere, or whether it's cyber or whatever it may be. That's a good question. Governments have to work together, whether it's a federal government, state level government, or a city or municipality. They all have to work together to find those disinformation networks and make sure they shut them down. But again, we have to remember this is coming at a cost to the government, and so you have to say, is it worth spending $40,000, or I'm just arbitrarily speaking here, or $100,000 trying to shut down a disinformation campaign? there's a cost factor that has to be taken into a play to how much you want to invest or pursue misinformation. And then we should be looking for more simpler ways. How can we get to the root of shutting down this disinformation? Can we go to the platform owner and say, can you remove this information? We find it to be untruthful. And so that's a really good question. I think there needs to be a lot of more research around that too. How can countries work together to find disinformation? Thank you for that question. You know, that's a really good question too. What kind of punishment should be introduced to disinformation targeting to harm national security or disrupt major public goods? I think there are some laws around that. Now, what the degree of punishment is, again, how much is the country willing to pursue to punish these individuals, right? And that's the one thing that I had to realize a couple of weeks ago. You know, I was very fortunate to be able to sit down with two FBI agents who worked in cybercrime and talk to them about how do they, develop their cases and what was their financial minimum or maximum. And they was like, it's really based on the evidence, and it's also based on the timing and the manpower resource that you can pursue, that they had to take in consideration to pursue some of this. And so it really wasn't a clear answer. And so we know that when some of these cases are more public, of course, those are the things that the lawyers are going to pursue. But in some cases, they're overwhelmed, just like any other system or resource we have today. So they have to make a calculated decision. But if I had to say what kind of punishment, I'm all about, jail time. I'm also about, I've read a couple of cases where people don't have that access to the internet removed. Now, do I think it's possible to remove somebody access from the internet? I don't think so. I think there's other ways that those individuals can access the internet that circumvent the policy of the law that they might be violating, that they had imposed on them by some court system. The next question is, what legal and policy measures can be implemented to effectively deter the spread of disinformation from policymakers or government, from governments? I think what we have to do is we have to, in this case, I'm going to talk about social media platforms, hold them accountable. Hold them accountable and fine them. If you start fining them for allowing misinformation and disinformation content to be hosted on their websites, that's a game changer. But then we get into some of the legalities of it. It's not as clear because remember, people have constitutional rights. We're a democratic country. And so it gets into a long game of legal warfare. But I do believe that legislators need to work harder to hold social media platform owners more accountable to do more. And then also to use like fact checkers to make sure that they are reporting factual information. But again, that's a cost that the platform owners will have to eat. And so how do we tell arbitrarily a social media platform owner, you got to invest $8 million in a fact checking technology to make sure you're only posting factual information? They can counter that and say, we want to support people constitutional rights, right? And so again, this is very complicated. Then you get into the argument of, even though somebody might say something that you don't believe, you find it to be erroneous information or you find it to be untruthful, they might argue to say that it is truthful, right? And so how do you settle that? And so this is a lot more complicated than what we think it is. But I think, as long as we continue to have the discussion and the discourse like we're having right now about this, we can continue to create a level of awareness that eventually we all can contribute to having the discussion about how do we, combat misinformation and disinformation. And I think the federal government can do more. But I think when you look at companies like, Meta, you look at companies like X and some of the other social media platform owners, they lobby heavy to be able to do the things that they do on their platforms. And so that, again, they make the money and they pay the money for their platforms to do exactly what their platforms are doing. How can criminal authorities in your country investigate and find disinformation networks? I would tell you, a lot of times we know because people That's the one thing I would tell you about people. People, we are a very smart society, and people don't mind telling you when something's not right or when there's some disinformation going on. Again, we have to also have to understand this. Here's something I want you all to think about. Disinformation is not new. It's new to the digital environment because we are building a digital environment every day, but we've been using misinformation for decades, especially countries when they're trying to influence their constituencies and the citizens of those countries. They've been using misinformation and disinformation for decades, trying to influence them to behave a certain way. And so where we might, in our country, where we might see it as being criminal, in their country, they might see it as being political, the right thing to do. So that's why it's so hard for us to have a global approach to this, because countries have opposing views on what's right and what's wrong. Yeah, I think we answered that about what punishment. Yeah, we answered that. What legal policies, measures can be implemented to, yeah, we answered that one. Does the constitutional right of speech protect persons, organizations spreading disinformation? Again, that get back to the argument, because you believe it's wrong, that doesn't mean the person's disseminating it believes it's wrong. And this is a tough fight. When I sit down and when I talk with, legal experts, it's not always clear. It's not always clear on how do we know, are we impeding on somebody's constitutional right? Because they believe something that's wrong, does it not necessarily make them wrong? And I know that's a hard pill to swallow, because we, for me, I wish that we can only put factual things on the internet. That's not always the case, because what I believe is factual, somebody might say they don't believe it, right? And it's not factual. And so that's why we see these things, and that's why this particular argument is tough. And that's also why it's very difficult for social media organizations to police their own platforms, because they cannot just take it on their own to you know to impose against somebody's constitutional right. They can't. They risk the organization in doing so. And this is why we can call it out if it's disinformation, and we can say, hey, that is wrong. But think about it, though. We hear it on the news every day, where we have other countries meddling in our business in the US, especially in our politics. And then other countries hear cases where they say the US is meddling in their business. And it's all, some people say that might be disinformation, that might be misinformation, whatever it may be, it happens. It's a part of national security. National security is not necessarily always a pretty present with a bow on. Sometimes it comes in the most uh, barbaric things. And so we have to understand that this combating misinformation and disinformation is not easy. It's a tough business. And most of the things we argue about when it comes to misinformation and disinformation probably is, when talking with lawyers, will tell you it's very low. But there are things that happen where, for instance, people are instructing people to do things that's very harmful. That takes on a different level, right? And so those are the things that lawyers and legal experts engage in right away, trying to get those things removed and changed, because it's harming others. Now, I did say earlier that being on the social media platform is we it can be harmful to all of our cognitive abilities and our own cognitive state, because we see so much of it. And that's why we have to fight through to find the truth. And that's why we have to make sure we have the awareness, and we have the literacy to understand, how do I find the facts, and uh, how do we contest if something's not right. We have to have the resiliency to do that. Are there any other questions? And would you like to add something, Ann?
Thank you. I think you covered it really well. And overall, in response to the questions that have come through, we can always say, well, what is the government doing? What are some legal policy changes that we can bring in place? But I would also encourage us to be thinking of what it is that we as citizens, as individuals, can and should be doing differently, or maybe not. So the next time you receive an alert and you're ready to post that to your network, wherever that might be, I would ask that we pause and consider and think through the implications. And I think each of us can make the world a little safer, one click at a time. That's my perspective.
Thank you, Ed. Absolutely. All right. If there's no questions, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.